So we're gonna create our first little animated project. We're gonna do an exercise. So we're gonna go to create new, and with this dialog box, we have a few standard options. We're just gonna go with the HD, which is 1280 by 720. And you will notice that there's the frame rate. We're gonna stick with 24 frames per second. We could also do 30 frames per second, but 24 is kind of the more traditional approach when animation was done on film. And this is our interface. It's pretty simple. We'll go into some more specifics later on how we can set up our interface to look like what I have right here. Yours might look slightly different. Right now we have one layer down at the bottom, and we're gonna just go and put in Pendulum. And this is just gonna be where we're gonna draw two basic shapes. We're going to create an oval, and we have a little bit of parameters on our left hand side. I'm just going to turn off the stroke right here so that way we are just getting a fill. And I'm going to just click and drag, hold shift, and it will make a perfect circle. And as I do this, you'll notice that in our timeline right next to Pendulum, it actually filled in that first frame. And now I'm going to make a rectangular form. Once again, the stroke is off. Now I'm going to select these shapes and I'm going to turn them into objects using that button right there. So create an object and make sure you select all of it in order to turn it into an object. And the reason I do this is it'll make it easier for us to align these objects together so that they're perfectly centered. I'll explain this in greater detail in a little while, but we're just going to go through these steps. So I'll right click and we can go to align and horizontal center, and boom, there we go. And so now I have to select both of them, and this next step is absolutely critical. Otherwise, what we want to do for this little exercise will not work. So we selected both of them, right clicked, and then we went to create symbol, and we're checking on creating a graphic. Make sure you name it accordingly. And I'm going to just drag this down so that it's more or less center in our composition, and I'm going to go and use the transform button. Now in the center here is a little white circle, and that is our axis point or our pivot point. So now by moving that, when I go to rotate that symbol, it pivots along that designated point, and now you can see what we're essentially trying to achieve. So we're on frame 1, and now I'm going to go to frame 30. You could go to frame 40, you could go to frame 20, it doesn't really matter. But now I right clicked on frame 30 and I'm putting insert keyframe. So I'm going to drag this so it's pretty much completely mirrored to the other side and let go. And so now it's going to essentially remember that that is the next major point in our animation. So our next keyframe. As we go further into learning more about animation, some people will call these keys, some people will call these extremes. We'll get into kind of the nuance of that later on. And so I just set this up. I copied our first frame and pasted it at 60, so that way we essentially have a loop. Now at the moment, these are just going to those distinct keyframes with nothing happening in between, so it would be really jittery, completely jittery. But if I right click and hover my mouse on the timeline in between those keyframes, I can essentially add in what's known as a tween. And the tween on like Adobe Animate or Flash, whatever you like to call it, and any sort of computer-based animation software will essentially interpret the frames in between those keyframes. So it's kind of doing some of the animation for you. However, as you can see as I play through this, it's kind of not really what we want. It's completely even in terms of the motion. And I can go up to control and do test movie, and sometimes this is going to be more of an accurate read on how this will play back, because sometimes Adobe Animate might be choppy if you just use the controls above the timeline. And so now I'm going to go in and adjust this. And we talked about timing briefly as one of the 12 principles of animation, and we're going to go and adjust it. So on our right hand side, you can see that we have tweening, and we have a bunch of different properties when we click on it. So by default, we're in no ease, and we want to essentially add ease in and ease out. And we want to kind of tweak it a little bit. Make sure that after you go in and click on ease in and ease out, and whatever option you want, you double click on where I have Quint. And that's going to apply it to that tween. And now when we play back, you can see that it's holding on the extreme poses. And so it's giving us more of an illusion of weight and more closely mimics what we are after. And this is just a very brief introduction into how we can use Adobe Animate and apply some of the core principles of animation to what we're after. Now we'll go into a lot more as we continue in this course, but this should just give us a little hint of what we have at our fingertips.